When you think of the Mexican Revolution, what comes to mind? Maybe Pancho Villa, maybe sombreros and rifles. But what we're talking about here, from 1910 to 1920, wasn't just some change of president or a few scattered battles. No, this was a massive, nationwide upheaval, a social earthquake that completely redrew the map of Mexico. So let's get into it and figure out why.
And that's not just me being dramatic. A historian perfectly described it as a gigantic tremor. And that's exactly what it was. A whole decade of conflict, fueled by huge ideals, crushing betrayals, and this deep, powerful hunger to just completely shatter a system that had pushed millions and millions of people into poverty.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this social earthquake, we're going to break it down into 5 key parts. First, we'll look at the illusion of progress that set the stage. Then, we'll see how that revolutionary spark was lit. After that, things get messy. We'll see how the revolution started to devour itself. We'll face the brutal reality of the war. And finally, we'll explore the brand new Mexico that was forged in all that fire. All right, first up, the illusion of progress. So to really understand why a revolution even happened, you've got to go back to the era of this guy, Porfirio Diaz. It was called the Porfiriato, and his whole motto was order and progress. And you know what? If you just looked at the surface, it really seemed like Mexico was becoming this super modern nation.
I mean, on one hand, you had some very real signs of progress, right? Thousands of miles of new railways crisscrossing the country, foreign investment was just pouring in. But, and this is a huge but, all of this came at a staggering price. This was a brutal dictatorship. There were no free elections, the press was completely censored, and the whole system was basically designed to funnel wealth into the hands of a tiny, tiny elite. So yeah, progress, but for who? For the very few.
And at the absolute heart of the problem was land. I mean, for most Mexicans, land was everything. It was their life. And yet, it was almost all in the hands of a select few. I mean, look at these numbers. In some states, just 1% of the population controlled over 90% of the farmland. Think about that. So what happened? Well, peasants were kicked off the lands their families had worked for generations, forced to work for pennies on these massive estates, these haciendas. And if that wasn't enough, on top of all that, the country's most valuable stuff, we're talking oil, mines, the railroads, it was all controlled by foreign companies. You had giants like Standard Oil and Royal Dutch Shell making insane profits, while the Mexican people, well, they saw almost none of it. Mexico was an incredibly rich country. It's just that the wealth wasn't for Mexicans. So you've got this powder keg just waiting to explode. And into this steps the man who's gonna light the fuse, Francisco Madero. Now, he came from a wealthy family, but he had this dream of a real, actual democracy for Mexico. And once he lit that spark, man, things ignited fast. In 1908, Madero openly challenged Diaz's 30-year rule. Of course, he gets thrown in jail, but he escapes to the US, and in 1910, he calls for an armed uprising. And that call just set the entire country on fire. I mean, in less than a year, the dictator who seemed all-powerful was forced to pack his bags and flee the country. Now, Madero's call was answered by some truly legendary figures. Up in the north, you had Pancho Villa. He was this incredibly charismatic, brilliant military leader. He put together this army of peasants, workers, and even adventurers, and he became this kind of Robin Hood figure for the poor. And at the same time, down in the south, another powerful leader was rising up, Emiliano Zapata. He was a farmer from the state of Morelos, and he became the absolute symbol of the fight for the land, the struggle to get the land back to the people who were actually working it. Zapata's rallying cry was so simple, yet so powerful. Tierra y libertad, land and liberty. That slogan, those 3 words, captured the deepest desire of millions of Mexicans. It became the banner for the most radical, most passionate part of the revolution. So the dictator is gone. Madero becomes president. It seems like the revolution won, right? Well, tragically, the fight was just getting started. The very same revolutionaries who had united to fight a common enemy, they were about to turn on each other. You see, Madero tried to create a democracy, but he was stuck in the middle. The radicals, guys like Zapata, felt he wasn't moving fast enough on land reform, but the old guard, the rich landowners, the powerful generals, they saw him as a major threat. And in 1913, he was betrayed and murdered in a coup. And just like that, Mexico was plunged right back into chaos.
That assassination basically kicked off a civil war inside the revolution. It split into two main camps. On one side, you had the constitutionalists, led by men like Carranza and Obregón. They wanted to build a strong, modern, centralized state. On the other side were the conventionalists, Villa and Zapata. They were fighting for a much more radical vision, immediate land redistribution, real social justice. And these guys who had been allies, they became the bitterest of enemies. So, while we often remember the revolution for its heroes and its big ideas, we have to face the brutal reality of what this was. For a decade, violence just became a part of everyday life. And the human cost, it's just staggering. It's estimated that over 1 million people, soldiers and civilians, lost their lives. Just let that number sink in for a second. That was roughly 10% of the entire country's population at the time. 1 in every 10 people. Gone. It's a catastrophe on a scale that's almost impossible to imagine. The regular people, the civilians, they were just trapped in the middle of it all. There were mass executions, people were forced to join armies, there was looting, and this was being done by all the factions. Nobody had clean hands here. The economy just collapsed, railways were torn apart, and millions of people had to flee their homes. And for so many, that original promise of land reform, it never happened. The new revolutionary bosses were often just as brutal as the old ones. But, and this is what's so incredible, out of all that destruction, something completely new was born. The revolution, as brutal as it was also this powerful creative force. It didn't just break the old Mexico, it laid the foundation for a new one. Right in the middle of all this chaos, they wrote a new constitution in 1917. And you guys, this was one of the most progressive, forward-thinking documents in the entire world at that time. It guaranteed rights for workers, it established free, public, secular education, but the biggest deal was Article 27. It declared that the nation, not private companies, owned all the land and all the natural resources. This was a radical idea, a direct shot at the foreign powers that had been exploiting Mexico for decades. The revolution also completely transformed the soul of the country. A new national identity started to bubble up, one that celebrated Mexico's indigenous and peasant roots, instead of being ashamed of them. You had artists like Diego Rivera who took art out of the fancy galleries and painted these enormous, powerful murals on public buildings, telling the story of the people's struggle for everyone to see. In a lot of ways, this was a new Mexico, looking at itself, really seeing itself for the very first time. So did the revolution fix all of Mexico's problems? No, not by a long shot. But what it did was completely change the rules of the game. It forced issues like land, justice, and who controls the nation's wealth right onto the table. And honestly, they're still on the table to this day. Because when you boil it all down, that decade of fire and blood wasn't just a war. It was a collective roar from the people of Mexico. It was a simple but profound declaration that said, this country is ours too.